The lights of Tokyo glittered like scattered diamonds beneath my hotel window, a galaxy of neon and ambition stretching toward the horizon. In 12 hours, my first flagship store in Asia would open its doors, and I would finally prove what I had known for 12 years. The junk nobody wanted was about to sell out in one of the most discerning markets in the world. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and watched my reflection, a 42-year-old black woman who had traveled from a folding table at a community craft fair to a boutique on Omotesando, Tokyo's most prestigious fashion avenue. The journey between those 2 points had been paved with rejection, heartbreak, and one devastating sentence that still echoed in my mind whenever I doubted myself. Nobody wants your junk, Celeste. This is embarrassing. 12 years. Those words were 12 years old, spoken by a man I had once loved, in a moment designed to break me. Instead, they had become the fuel that powered an empire. I turned from the window and picked up my phone, scrolling through the messages from my team. Everything was ready for tomorrow. The collection was displayed, the press invites sent, the guest list confirmed. Japanese celebrities, international fashion editors, and buyers from department stores across Asia would be there to witness the arrival of Adaora in Tokyo. But my mind was not on tomorrow. It was on the past, on the day everything had started, on a crisp October morning in Atlanta, when I had believed that sharing my work with the world would bring me joy. The craft fair was held in a park near our neighborhood, one of those community events where local artisans displayed handmade jewelry, pottery, and woodwork, alongside vendors selling kettle corn and fresh lemonade. I had been preparing for months, working late into the night after our daughter Simone went to bed, cutting fabric and stitching leather and dreaming of the moment when strangers would see my creations and recognize their beauty. My table was modest but carefully arranged. 20 handbags sat on display, each one a unique combination of African print fabric and hand-stitched leather. I had sourced the fabrics from specialty importers, selecting Ankara prints from Nigeria, kente cloth from Ghana, and mud cloth from Mali. Each pattern told a story, carried a meaning, connected to a culture that ran through my blood, even though I had never visited the continent of my ancestors. My grandmother Adaize had taught me to sew when I was 7 years old. She had emigrated from Nigeria in 1962, bringing with her a suitcase full of fabrics and a head full of traditions. While other children spent summers at camps and pools, I spent mine at her kitchen table, learning to thread a needle, to cut a straight line, to transform flat fabric into three-dimensional beauty. "Your hands have a gift, Celeste," she would say, guiding my small fingers along a seam. "Someday, they will create things that the whole world wants to see." I had believed her then. Standing at my craft fair table at 30 years old, watching strangers walk past without a second glance, I was beginning to doubt. Roland stood beside me, his arms crossed, his expression radiating the discomfort he had barely concealed all morning. He had not wanted to come. He had called this venture a waste of time from the beginning, had rolled his eyes when I showed him my designs, had complained about the money I spent on supplies. "This is beneath you," he had said the night before. "Sitting at a table selling crafts like some kind of street vendor. What will people think?" Roland was a vice president at a consulting firm, the son of a doctor and a judge, raised to believe that respectability meant corner offices and country club memberships. He measured success in titles and salaries, in the approval of people he considered important. A wife who made handbags in the basement did not fit his image of an appropriate partner. But he had come anyway, perhaps hoping that the failure of my first fair would convince me to abandon this foolishness and focus on supporting his career like a proper executive's wife. The morning passed slowly. A few people stopped to admire the bags, running their fingers over the vibrant fabrics, commenting on the craftsmanship. But admiration did not translate to sales. By noon, I had sold exactly one bag, a small clutch purchased by a kind-faced elderly woman who reminded me of my grandmother. "These are beautiful," the woman had said. "Don't give up. The right people will find you." I thanked her and tried to hold on to her encouragement. But Roland's presence beside me was a constant weight. his sighs and glances at his watch, a running commentary on my failure. At 1 o'clock, he made the announcement that would define our relationship for the remainder of our marriage. "Nobody wants your junk, Celeste." He said it loud enough for the vendors on either side of us to hear, loud enough for passing customers to register. "This is embarrassing. Can we please go home now?" I felt the words land like blows, each one striking a different part of my soul. Nobody wants your junk. He had dismissed months of work, years of dreaming, a lifetime of preparation in a single sentence. And he had done it publicly, in front of strangers, stripping away any pretense that he respected what I was trying to build. I did not respond. I could not. If I opened my mouth, I would either scream or cry, and I was not willing to give him the satisfaction of either. "Fine." Roland threw up his hands. "Stay here with your crafts. I'll be in the car." He walked away, leaving me alone at my table, surrounded by the beautiful bags that apparently nobody wanted. I watched his retreating figure and felt something shift inside me, a small but significant rearrangement of priorities. I had spent 8 years of marriage trying to be what Roland wanted, shrinking myself to fit inside his expectations. But I could not shrink myself any further without disappearing entirely. If he thought my work was junk, then so be it. I would prove him wrong. The afternoon brought a few more sales, enough to cover the cost of my table rental, but not much more. I was packing up when a woman approached, her eyes fixed on a tote bag made from indigo Adir fabric. "Did you make these?" She picked up the bag, examining the stitching, the leather straps, the interior lining. "Yes, everything is handmade. The craftsmanship is exceptional." She looked at me with sharp, assessing eyes. "I'm Naomi Cross. I own a boutique in Buckhead. Would you be interested in wholesale arrangements?" I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "Wholesale? I'd like to carry your bags in my store. They're exactly the kind of unique, culturally grounded pieces my customers are looking for." She handed me a business card. "Call me this week. I think we could do something special together." I watched her walk away, her card clutched in my trembling hand. One person. One person who saw value where my husband saw junk. One person who believed in what I was creating. I drove home that evening with Roland's words still ringing in my ears, but something else had taken root alongside the hurt. A tiny flame of determination that his contempt had failed to extinguish. Naomi Cross had seen something in my work. That meant others might see it too. I was not going to give up. I was just going to stop sharing my dreams with someone who could not appreciate them. The conversation with Roland that night was brief and bitter. "So, your little craft fair was a success?" he asked sarcastically as I walked through the door, still carrying boxes of unsold inventory. "I made some sales." I set the boxes down, not meeting his eyes. "And a boutique owner wants to carry my bags in her store." Roland laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "One sale to a boutique doesn't make you a businesswoman, Celeste. Let's not get carried away." "I'm not getting carried away. I'm telling you what happened. What happened is you sat in a park all day selling crafts for pocket change while I was supposed to be at the Hendersons' brunch." He loosened his tie with an aggressive jerk. "Do you know how embarrassing it was to explain where you were? I told you a month ago about the craft fair. You could have gone to the brunch alone." "That's not the point. The point is that my wife should be at my side at social functions, not hawking merchandise like a street vendor." He dropped onto the couch, reaching for the remote. "I hope this phase passes soon. It's becoming tiresome." I stood in the middle of our living room, looking at the man I had married, wondering when he had become a stranger. Or perhaps he had always been this person, and I had simply been too blinded by love to see it. "It's not a phase," I said quietly. "What?" "Making these bags, building something of my own. It's not a phase, Roland. It's what I want to do with my life." He looked at me with an expression I had seen before, but never fully understood until that moment. It was not just dismissiveness. It was fear. Fear that I might become something more than he expected, more than he could control, more than he could explain to his important friends. "We'll see," he said, and turned on the television. I went to my workshop in the basement and stayed there until midnight, sketching new designs, planning my call with Naomi Cross, dreaming of possibilities that Roland could not imagine. The walls of that basement were covered with fabric samples and design sketches, a visual record of everything I wanted to create. It was my sanctuary, the one place in our house where I felt entirely myself. I thought about my grandmother, about the stories she had told me while teaching me to sew. She had come to America with nothing but her skills and her traditions, had built a life through determination and craft. She would not have let a dismissive husband stop her from pursuing her dreams. She would have smiled at his contempt and worked harder. I picked up a piece of Ankara fabric, tracing the geometric patterns with my finger. This cloth had traveled across an ocean to reach me. It carried the hands of the women who wove it, the eyes of the artists who designed it, the history of a people who had survived centuries of hardship through creativity and resilience. Roland saw junk. I saw ancestry. I saw power. I saw the future. I called Naomi Cross the next morning and scheduled a meeting for later that week. She wanted to see more of my work, to discuss pricing and quantities, to explore what a partnership might look like. She spoke to me like a professional, like an equal, like someone whose work had value. It was a small thing, that meeting, a boutique owner in Atlanta showing interest in a first-time designer. But it was also everything. It was the first external validation I had received, the first crack in the wall of doubt that Roland had been building around me for years. I did not tell Roland about the meeting. I did not tell him when Naomi placed her first order for 12 bags. I did not tell him when those bags sold out within a month and she asked for more. I stopped sharing my successes with a man who could only see them as failures, and I started building in silence. That silence would last for years. Through the growth of my business, through the unraveling of my marriage, through everything that would eventually lead me to a hotel room in Tokyo, watching the city lights and preparing to prove that what he called junk was actually gold. But I did not know any of that yet, standing in my basement workshop at 30 years old. I only knew that I would not give up, that I would not let his words define me, that I would create beauty whether he appreciated it or not. Grandmother Adaze had been right. My hands had a gift, and I was going to share it with the world, no matter what Roland thought. Nobody wanted my junk? We would see about that. The first year was the hardest. Building a business while maintaining a marriage to someone who actively hoped for failure required a kind of compartmentalization that exhausted me on a cellular level. By day, I was Roland's wife, attending the social functions he deemed important, smiling at colleagues who saw me only as an appendage to his career. By night and weekend, I was the designer behind what would eventually become Adora, stitching bags at my kitchen table after everyone else was asleep, developing relationships with fabric suppliers, learning the business side of fashion through trial and error. Roland watched my growing inventory with the tolerant amusement of someone humoring a child's passing fancy. He was certain, absolutely certain, that this phase would end, that I would grow tired of the late nights and the inconsistent sales, that I would return to being the supportive wife who asked about his day and cared about his promotions. "How long are you going to keep this up?" he asked one evening, watching me wrap an order for shipment. "As long as it takes." "As long as what takes? Until you realize this isn't going anywhere?" He shook his head. "Celeste, be realistic. You're making handbags in the basement. That's not a career. That's a hobby. Naomi sells out of my bags within weeks. She can't keep them in stock. One boutique in Atlanta. That's not a business. That's a favor from a friend. She's not my friend. She's my client. And she's talking about introducing me to other boutique owners." Roland sighed with the weariness of a man whose patience was being tested. "Whatever makes you happy, I suppose. Just don't let it interfere with our actual life. Our actual life." As if the hours I spent creating, building, dreaming were somehow less real than the cocktail parties and golf outings that comprised his social calendar. I stopped responding to his dismissals. They were background noise now, static on a radio I had learned to tune out. Every bag I sold, every positive review I received, every new wholesale account I opened was another brick in the wall of evidence that Roland was wrong. Someday, I promised myself, that evidence would be undeniable. The business grew slowly but steadily. Naomi Cross introduced me to 3 other boutique owners in Atlanta, each of whom placed small orders that sold through quickly. I expanded my product line, adding clutches and crossbody bags to my original tote designs. I developed a website, taught myself about search engine optimization and social media marketing, built an online presence that started attracting customers from beyond the Atlanta area. By the end of year 2, I was making consistent monthly sales that exceeded my old salary as a marketing coordinator, the job I had left when Simone was born and never returned to. I was not getting rich, but I was proving that this was more than a hobby. I reinvested every penny back into the business, knowing that growth required resources I did not yet have. Roland never noticed the money flowing through accounts he did not bother to monitor. He assumed I was playing at business while he carried the financial weight of our household, a narrative that suited his ego and my purposes equally well. In year 3, I took the step that would define everything that followed. I named the brand Adaora. The word meant daughter of the people in Igbo, my grandmother's native language. It was perfect, a tribute to Grandmother Adaeze, a connection to my Nigerian heritage, a statement about who I was and what I was creating. Adaora was not just a handbag company. It was a bridge between Africa and America, a celebration of cultural heritage, a declaration that beauty could be both traditional and modern. I hired a graphic designer to create a logo, an abstract representation of Adinkra symbols, the West African pictographs that conveyed philosophical concepts through visual form. I had hang tags printed explaining the meaning of each fabric pattern, the region it came from, the stories it told. Each bag became more than an accessory. It became a piece of cultural education. Adaora? Roland examined one of my new tags with undisguised skepticism. What does that even mean? It's Igbo. It means daughter of the people. Nobody's going to be able to pronounce that. They'll learn. He dropped the tag back onto the table. You're overcomplicating this. If you're going to sell bags, just sell bags. All this cultural stuff is going to confuse people. I picked up the tag and smoothed it carefully. The cultural stuff is what makes Adaora special. It's what makes us different from every other bag company. Us? Roland laughed. There's no us. There's just you, playing designer in the basement. Not anymore. I met his eyes, feeling a strength I had not possessed at that first craft fair. I have 3 part-time employees now, 2 seamstresses and a shipping coordinator. We're a team. The shock on Roland's face was almost worth the years of dismissal. He had not known about the employees, had not noticed the changes that were transforming his wife's hobby into a genuine company. He had been so certain that my failure was inevitable that he had stopped paying attention. You hired people? With what money? My money. From sales. Sales of what? How much could you possibly be making from crafts? Enough to pay 3 employees and still turn a profit. I walked past him toward the basement stairs. I have orders to fill. Good night, Roland. I left him standing in the kitchen, processing information that did not fit his understanding of reality. The wife he had dismissed was building something real, something that employed other people, something that was growing despite his certainty that it would fail. That night, I worked until 3 in the morning, filling orders and planning for the future. I had applied to Atlanta Fashion Week's Emerging Designers program, a long shot that would put my work in front of buyers and press from across the region. The chances of acceptance were slim. Hundreds of designers applied for fewer than 20 spots. But I had learned that long shots sometimes paid off, and I was done betting against myself. The acceptance email arrived 6 weeks later on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I read it 3 times before I believed it was real. Adaora has been selected to participate in Atlanta Fashion Week's Emerging Designers Showcase. Congratulations. I did not tell Roland. I did not tell anyone except my grandmother's photograph, which I kept on my workbench as a reminder of where I had started. We did it, Grandma, I whispered to the faded image. We're going to Fashion Week. Her smile seemed to grow brighter, as if she could hear me across the divide between worlds. Atlanta Fashion Week was a revelation. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who understood what I was trying to create, who saw value in the intersection of African heritage and modern design, who treated me like a legitimate member of the fashion community. My booth was modest compared to some of the established designers, but the response was overwhelming. Buyers from regional department stores stopped to examine my bags, asking about wholesale pricing and minimum orders. Fashion bloggers photographed the collection, posting images to their followers. A reporter from a local magazine interviewed me about my inspiration and process, treating my story like something worth telling. "The craftsmanship is incredible," one buyer told me, turning a tote bag inside out to examine the lining. "And the cultural connection gives it a narrative that customers respond to. They're not just buying a bag, they're buying a story." I nodded, trying not to show how much her words affected me. A story. That was exactly what I was selling. The story of my grandmother, of Nigeria, of traditions that had survived displacement and emerged stronger on the other side. Roland did not attend Fashion Week. He claimed a conflict with work, though I suspected the truth was simpler. He did not want to be seen supporting an endeavor he still considered beneath him. His absence was a relief. For 3 days, I could exist in the fashion world without his dismissive presence, without his sighs and eye rolls, without the constant reminder that he thought my work was junk. The event generated more orders than I could fill with my small team. I spent the following months scrambling to expand, hiring additional seamstresses, negotiating with fabric suppliers for larger quantities, searching for a commercial space that could accommodate our growing operation. The basement was no longer sufficient. Adaora needed room to breathe. I found a small warehouse in an industrial area near the airport, affordable enough that I could manage the rent with existing revenue. The space needed work, paint, better lighting, dedicated workstations, but it was mine. My first real business address, separate from the house I shared with a husband who had never believed in what I was building. Moving day was bittersweet. I packed up the basement workshop where I had started, carrying boxes of fabric and equipment to the rental van that would transport them to the new space. Roland watched from the kitchen door, his expression unreadable. "You're really doing this," he said. It was not a question. "I've been doing this for 4 years. You just haven't been paying attention." "I've been paying attention. I just assumed," he trailed off. "You assumed I would fail, that this was a phase that would pass." I set down the box I was carrying. "But it's not passing, Roland. It's growing. And I'm going to keep growing it whether you support me or not." Something flickered across his face. Not respect, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of an acknowledgement that he had underestimated me. "I never said you would fail," he started. "Nobody wants your junk, Celeste." I quoted his words back to him, watching them land. "That's what you said at my first craft fair, in front of strangers, while I was trying to build something from nothing." Roland's jaw tightened. "That was years ago. I was frustrated. You were embarrassed, because your wife was doing something that didn't fit your image of respectability." I picked up the box again. "I've spent 4 years proving you wrong, and I have a lot more to prove before I'm done." I walked out to the van, leaving him standing in the doorway. Our marriage had been dying for years, killed by his contempt and my growing independence. The move to the warehouse was just another step in a separation that was becoming increasingly inevitable. The magazine profile appeared 3 months later. "Atlanta designer bridges Africa and America through fashion," read the headline, accompanied by photographs of my bags and a flattering portrait of me at work in the new warehouse. The article told my story: grandmother's immigration, learning to sew as a child, the cultural significance of the fabrics I used, and positioned Adaora as a rising star in the world of ethical fashion. I did not show Roland the article, but he found it anyway. A colleague at his firm had mentioned seeing his wife in a magazine, and he had tracked down a copy with barely concealed irritation. "You're becoming quite the celebrity," he said that evening, dropping the magazine on the kitchen counter. "I'm building a brand. Press coverage is part of that. People are talking, at the office, at the club. They're asking about my wife, the designer. His tone made it clear this was not a compliment. Is that a problem? It's a distraction. It makes people think. He hesitated, searching for words. It makes people think I don't provide for my family, that my wife has to work to make ends meet. I stared at him, genuinely astonished. After 4 years of dismissing my work as insignificant, his primary concern was still how it reflected on him. I'm not working because you don't provide enough, Roland. I'm working because I have something to offer the world, because my grandmother gave me skills and traditions that I want to share, because building Adaora makes me happy in a way that nothing else does. Happier than being my wife? The question hung between us, heavy with implications neither of us was ready to address. Ask yourself, I said quietly, whether you've ever made me as happy as my work does, and then ask yourself why. I went to my workshop in the warehouse and stayed until midnight, as I did most nights now. The distance between Roland and me was growing with every passing month, and I no longer had the energy to close it. He had made his choice at that craft fair 12 years ago, when he decided that my dreams were junk. Now I was making mine. The photograph changed everything. A single image, posted to social media by a celebrity's assistant, shared thousands of times within hours, transforming Adaora from a regional success into an international phenomenon. The celebrity was Amara Okonkwo, a Nigerian-American actress who had just won an Emmy for her work in a critically acclaimed drama. She had been photographed arriving at an awards ceremony after-party, and on her arm was one of my bags, a medium tote made from vintage kente cloth, with leather straps in a deep burgundy that complemented her gown. I learned about the photograph the same way everyone else did, through the explosion of notifications on my phone. Orders flooded in faster than I could count them. My website crashed from the traffic. Fashion journalists who had never heard of Adaora were suddenly requesting interviews, wanting to know about the emerging designer whose bag had caught the eye of one of Hollywood's most stylish stars. I discovered later that Amara had purchased the bag from Naomi's boutique during a visit to Atlanta. She had been drawn to the cultural connection, she said in a later interview, the way the bag celebrated African heritage while maintaining a modern, sophisticated aesthetic. She became a vocal advocate for the brand, wearing Adaora pieces to multiple events and recommending us to her famous friends. But the immediate aftermath of that photograph was chaos. We can't fill these orders, my operations manager told me, her voice strained from exhaustion. We're months behind already. Every piece we produce sells before it's finished. Then we need to produce more. With what capacity? We're running at maximum output. To scale up, we need more space, more equipment, more staff. I knew she was right. The attention from Amara's photograph was a gift, but it was also a challenge. We could either rise to meet the demand or watch the opportunity slip away. There was no middle ground. I calculated the investment required and felt my stomach drop. We were talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money I did not have, money that would require loans or investors, money that represented a level of risk I had never taken before. I went to Roland. It was a desperate move, born from necessity rather than hope. But I thought perhaps the scale of the opportunity might finally impress him. I need capital to expand, I explained, showing him the projections my accountant had prepared. The demand is there. The brand recognition is there. I just need money to scale production. Roland examined the papers with his executive's eye, nodding at the numbers in a way that suggested he was taking me seriously for once. How much? 200,000 to start. More if we want to expand internationally. He set down the papers and leaned back in his chair. That's a lot of money to invest in handbags. It's a lot of money to invest in a company that's growing exponentially. Look at the projections. Within 2 years, Adaora could be worth millions. Could be. Or it could collapse when this celebrity moves on to the next trend. He shook his head. I'm not going to risk our financial security on your craft project, Celeste. You'll have to find another way. Our financial security. As if I had not been contributing to that security for years through my own earnings. As if the business I had built was somehow separate from the family we shared. Fine, I said, gathering my papers. I'll find another way. And I did. I secured a small business loan using Adora's financial records and projections to demonstrate our viability. The interest rate was higher than I would have liked, but it was money I controlled, money that came without Roland's contempt attached. The expansion was rapid and exhausting. I hired more seamstresses, leased a larger warehouse, invested in industrial sewing equipment that could produce bags faster without sacrificing quality. I traveled to Nigeria for the first time in my life, meeting the cooperatives of women who wove the fabrics I used, establishing direct purchasing relationships that ensured fair compensation for their work. The trip to Nigeria was transformative. I stood in villages where my grandmother had once lived, touched looms that were creating patterns passed down for generations, felt a connection to my heritage that I had only imagined before. I returned to Atlanta with a deeper understanding of what Adora represented, and a commitment to ensuring that the success of my company benefited the communities whose traditions had made it possible. Roland barely noticed my 2-week absence. When I returned with stories about Nigeria, about the artisans and their traditions, he listened with polite disinterest before changing the subject to something he considered more important. But someone else in our household was paying attention. Simone, now 12 years old, had been watching her mother's journey with growing fascination. She asked questions about the fabrics, about Nigeria, about the business of fashion. She sat beside me in the workshop, learning to sew as I had learned from my grandmother, absorbing skills and traditions that would one day be her inheritance. "Are you going to be famous, Mom?" she asked one evening, examining a bag I had just finished. "I don't know about famous, but I'm going to build something meaningful, something that matters." Dad doesn't think it matters. The observation, delivered with a child's blunt honesty, struck me hard. "What makes you say that?" "He never asks about your work. He changes the subject when you talk about it." Simone looked at me with eyes that were wise beyond her years. "But I think it's amazing. I want to be like you when I grow up." I hugged her tightly, grateful for her support, sad that she had perceived the dynamic between her parents so clearly. "You'll be better than me," I promised her. "Whatever you choose to do, you'll be amazing at it." The success continued to build. Orders came from boutiques across the country, then from department stores, then from international buyers who had seen Adora featured in fashion magazines. I was invited to speak at conferences about ethical fashion and cultural authenticity. I became a voice for African heritage in the American fashion industry, a role I had never sought but embraced with passion. Roland watched from the sidelines, his expression increasingly sour. The wife he had dismissed was becoming more successful than he had ever been, commanding attention and respect that he could not claim. Our marriage had become a shell, two people occupying the same house without any meaningful connection. The end came in month 14 after the Amara photograph, when I discovered that Roland had been having an affair. Her name was Vanessa, she was 15 years younger than him, and she worked in his firm's marketing department. The discovery was almost a relief, a clear reason to end what had been dying for years. "I want a divorce," Roland announced one evening, preempting the confrontation I had been planning. "I've met someone else, someone who prioritizes our relationship, who doesn't spend every night in a warehouse making crafts." I did not cry. I did not rage. I simply nodded. "Fine. I'll have my lawyer contact yours." Roland seemed disappointed by my composure, as if he had expected a scene, a plea, some validation of his importance in my life. Instead, I went to my home office and began organizing the documents I would need for the legal proceedings ahead. He had made his choice. He had chosen someone who would make him feel important, who would defer to his ego, who would never threaten his position as the successful one in the relationship. He was welcome to her. I had work to do. The divorce proceedings revealed what I had suspected for years. Roland's understanding of our financial situation was fundamentally flawed. He had assumed that his salary was the foundation of our household, that I was contributing nothing but hobby income, that he would be entitled to the house and the majority of our assets. He had no idea that Adora had become more valuable than his entire retirement portfolio. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, laid out the situation with clinical precision during our first strategy meeting. "The company is your separate property," she explained. "You founded it with your own resources, maintained separate accounts, never commingled marital funds with business revenue. Roland has no legal claim to any of it. He's going to fight that. He can fight whatever he wants. The documentation is clear. Adora is yours." Patricia smiled slightly. "The irony is that if he had shown any interest in your business over the years, he might have been able to claim some involvement. But from what you've told me, he actively dismissed and denigrated your work. Every chance he got. Then he's going to walk away with whatever standard division of marital assets applies, and not a penny of the company he spent years calling junk." The negotiations were contentious. Roland, upon learning the actual value of Adaora, now estimated at several $1,000,000, demanded a share of what he called marital enterprise. His lawyers argued that the business had been built during the marriage, using time and energy that should have been devoted to the household, and therefore constituted marital property regardless of how it was funded. Patricia demolished their arguments systematically. She produced records showing that I had maintained complete separation of finances. She submitted statements from my employees confirming that Roland had never participated in any aspect of the business. She even found social media posts where Roland's friends had joked about his wife's craft hobby, evidence that he had consistently dismissed and minimized the company he now wanted to claim. In the end, Roland walked away with half of our non-business assets, half the equity in the house, half the joint savings account, half of what we had accumulated together over 15 years of marriage. But Adaora remained mine, entirely and completely. "I hope your craft project makes you happy," he said bitterly on the day the divorce was finalized. "Because you're going to be alone with it." "I've been alone with it for years, Roland. Now I just won't have to pretend otherwise." He married Vanessa 3 months later, in a ceremony I did not attend and barely thought about. The man I had loved for 15 years had become a stranger, someone I passed occasionally at Simone's school events, someone I spoke to only about logistics and schedules. I focused on what mattered: my daughter, my company, my vision for the future. The year after the divorce was the most productive of my life. Freed from the weight of Roland's contempt, I threw myself into building Adaora with an energy I had not known I possessed. International expansion had always been a dream. Now it became a plan. The first international order came from London, a luxury boutique in Mayfair that had seen Adora featured in British Vogue. The second came from Paris, a concept store that specialized in African fashion. The third came from Dubai, where wealthy clients were eager for unique, culturally significant pieces that stood out from the ubiquitous designer labels. Each new market required adaptation. European customers preferred different sizes and styles than American ones. Middle Eastern clients wanted specific color palettes and levels of formality. I learned to listen to local partners, to adjust my designs without losing the cultural authenticity that defined the brand. By the end of that year, Adaora was selling in 12 countries, with plans for further expansion. I had been profiled in Forbes, interviewed on CNN, invited to speak at fashion conferences in Milan and Paris. The junk Roland had dismissed was now coveted by some of the most discerning consumers in the world. And then, the invitation came from Tokyo. A Japanese luxury conglomerate had been tracking Adaora's growth, impressed by our cultural narrative and artisanal quality. They proposed a partnership, a flagship store in Tokyo, Japan's most competitive and discerning fashion market, with the possibility of expansion throughout Asia if the launch succeeded. Tokyo, where Western brands went to prove their global appeal, where consumers demanded the highest standards of quality and authenticity, where success would cement Adaora's status as a truly international luxury brand. I accepted immediately. The preparation took 18 months. I developed a special collection for the Japanese market, incorporating fabrics that harmonized with Japanese aesthetic sensibilities while maintaining the African heritage at Adaora's core. I traveled to Tokyo multiple times, meeting with partners, selecting the retail space, ensuring that every detail of the launch would reflect the brand's values. On the eve of the opening, I stood in my Tokyo hotel room, looking out at the city lights, thinking about the journey that had brought me here. 12 years since a craft fair in Atlanta. 12 years since my husband told me that nobody wanted my junk. Tomorrow, I would prove him wrong in the most spectacular way imaginable. The Tokyo launch exceeded every expectation. The store, located on Omotesando, Tokyo's equivalent of Fifth Avenue, drew crowds from the moment it opened. Japanese fashion influencers posted images to their millions of followers. International media covered the event as evidence of African fashion's growing global influence, and the collection, carefully curated for the Japanese market, sold out completely within hours. I watched from behind the counter as customers examined each bag with the meticulous attention for which Japanese consumers were famous. They appreciated the craftsmanship, the quality of materials, the story behind each piece. Several asked detailed questions about the fabrics, wanting to understand the cultural significance of the patterns they were purchasing. "This is extraordinary," my Japanese partner Kenji said, as we surveyed the empty display cases at the end of the day. "We expected strong interest, but this is unprecedented. What happens now? Now we restock. Now we expand. Now we make Adara a permanent part of the Japanese fashion landscape." I nodded, trying to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. 12 years ago, I had been packing unsold bags into boxes while my husband declared my work worthless. Now I was standing in an empty boutique in Tokyo, having sold out an entire collection to customers who understood exactly what Adaora represented. That evening, I walked through the streets of Omotesando, absorbing the energy of a city that never seemed to sleep. The neon signs and crowded sidewalks reminded me how far I had traveled from the craft fair in Atlanta, from the basement workshop where I had sewn bags until midnight, from the marriage that had tried to contain me. My phone buzzed with a message from Simone, now 16 and finishing her junior year of high school. "Mom, I saw the photos from Tokyo. You're amazing. So proud of you." I smiled and typed a response. "Couldn't have done it without your support, baby. I'll bring you here someday. You'll love it. Promise?" "Promise." Simone had been my anchor through the divorce and beyond, the one person whose love was unconditional, whose faith in me never wavered. She had inherited my grandmother's gift for working with fabric, spending her weekends in the Adaora workshop, learning the skills that connected her to ancestors she had never known. "I want to work for you when I graduate," she had announced recently. "Not because you're my mom, but because Adaora is doing something important. I want to be part of it." I had agreed, with the caveat that she would need to earn her place like anyone else. But secretly, I was thrilled. The legacy that had begun with Grandmother Adai's would continue through another generation. My phone buzzed again, and I expected another message from Simone. Instead, I saw a name I had not expected. Roland. "Saw the news about Tokyo. Congratulations. You proved me wrong. I'm sorry for what I said all those years ago." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also sadness, for the marriage that might have been, for the partnership we could have built if Roland had ever believed in me, for the years lost to his contempt. I typed several responses, deleted each one, and finally settled on the simplest possible reply. Nothing. I closed the message thread and continued walking through the Tokyo night. Some apologies came too late to matter. Some wounds had healed without requiring the person who inflicted them to acknowledge their damage. Roland's recognition of my success did not change the years he had spent trying to undermine it. It was a footnote, nothing more. The months following Tokyo were a whirlwind of expansion and opportunity. The Japanese partnership led to stores in Osaka and Kyoto, then to inquiries from partners in Seoul and Singapore. European buyers increased their orders, and American department stores began dedicating significant floor space to Adaora products. The company that had started in my basement was now operating on 4 continents. I returned to Nigeria frequently, strengthening my relationships with the cooperatives that supplied my fabrics. Each trip deepened my connection to my grandmother's homeland, to the traditions that had survived colonization and globalization, to the women whose hands created the patterns that made Ada Ora unique. "You are bringing our work to the world," one elder weaver told me during a visit to her village. "Our grandmothers could never have imagined such a thing, but you have made it real." I thought of my own grandmother, of the traditions she had carried across an ocean, of the skills she had passed down through generations. Adora was more than a fashion brand. It was a bridge between worlds, a celebration of heritage, a proof that cultural traditions could thrive in a global marketplace. The financial success was substantial, but it was never the primary motivation. What drove me was the knowledge that each bag sold represented a connection between past and present, between Africa and America, between artisans in distant villages and consumers who valued their work. Forbes featured me in their annual Women Entrepreneurs issue, highlighting Ada Ora as an example of culturally conscious luxury. The article mentioned the revenue, now approaching $50 million annually, but focused more on the impact. The jobs created in Atlanta and Africa, the preservation of traditional textile arts, the model of ethical fashion that other designers were beginning to emulate. I kept a copy of that magazine in my office, not for vanity, but for reminder. The same hands that had been dismissed as producing junk had built something that Forbes considered worthy of celebration. The journey had been long, but the destination was more rewarding than I had ever imagined. Roland remarried and divorced within 3 years, according to the occasional updates I received through Simone. Vanessa, it turned out, was less interested in supporting his ego than she was in spending his money. And when the money ran out, a consequence of lifestyle choices that had always exceeded his income, so did she. I felt no satisfaction in his misfortune. Roland was simply someone I had known once, a chapter of my life that had closed and been filed away. I wished him whatever peace he could find, and I focused on the present. Ada Ora continued to grow. I opened a flagship store in New York, another in Los Angeles, began planning locations in London and Paris. The company employed over 200 people now, most of them women, many of them from communities that had few opportunities for skilled employment. On the 5th anniversary of the Tokyo launch, I held a celebration at the Atlanta warehouse where the expansion had begun. Employees past and present gathered to mark the milestone, sharing stories of how far we had come, dreaming about where we would go next. Simone gave a toast, her voice steady and confident, her grandmother's determination shining through every word. My mom started this company in a basement, making bags that her husband called junk. She didn't listen to him. She listened to herself, to her grandmother's voice, to the traditions that told her she had something valuable to offer the world. Simone raised her glass. Today, Ada Ora is in 15 countries. Today, we employ hundreds of people. Today, we've proven that junk can become gold if you believe in it enough. The room erupted in applause. I wiped tears from my eyes and hugged my daughter, feeling the connection between generations that had made all of this possible. "Grandma Adais would be proud," I whispered. "She is proud," Simone whispered back. "I know she is." The call from the White House came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, so unexpected that I almost dismissed it as a prank. But the voice on the other end was genuine, a representative from the First Lady's office, inviting me to participate in an event celebrating African American cultural entrepreneurs. "The First Lady has been following Ada Ora's growth," the representative explained. "She's particularly interested in how you've combined cultural heritage with modern business practices. She would like you to speak about your journey at the event." I accepted, of course. How could I not? But as I prepared my remarks in the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on the strange path that had brought me to this moment. 20 years earlier, I had been a young wife, recently married to a man I thought would be my partner in everything. I had dreams then, vague ambitions about doing something creative, making something beautiful. But I had also absorbed the expectations of the world around me, that women supported their husbands' careers, that practical concerns outweighed creative ones, that stability was more important than passion. It had taken years to unlearn those lessons, years of working in secret, building in silence, believing in myself when no one else did, years of enduring dismissal from the person who should have been my greatest supporter. But those years had made me who I was. The woman standing in front of the mirror now, preparing to address an audience at the White House, had been forged by struggle. She had learned that resilience was more valuable than approval, that persistence outlasted criticism, that the only opinion that ultimately mattered was her own. The White House event was everything I had imagined and more. I spoke to an audience of entrepreneurs, artists, and policymakers, telling the story of Adaora, of my grandmother, of the traditions that had survived across centuries and oceans. The First Lady shook my hand afterward and told me she had purchased several Adaora bags for herself. "You've created something remarkable," she said. "Not just a business, but a bridge. Between cultures, between generations, between past and future." "That was always the goal," I replied, even when I didn't know how to articulate it. The following year brought new challenges and new opportunities. China opened as a market, with stores in Shanghai and Beijing that introduced Adaora to hundreds of millions of potential customers. I established a training academy in Atlanta, teaching young designers the principles of culturally conscious fashion, hoping to inspire a generation of creators who would carry these values forward. I wrote a book, a memoir of sorts, tracing the journey from craft fair to international brand. It became a bestseller, adopted by business schools as a case study in perseverance and cultural entrepreneurship. I received invitations to speak at universities, to consult for other brands, to advise governments on supporting creative industries. Through it all, I remained grounded in the work that had started it all, the bags themselves. I still spent time in the workshop, still reviewed designs personally, still insisted on meeting every artisan whose fabrics we used. The company had grown beyond anything I had imagined, but its soul remained the same. Simone graduated from college with a degree in business and fashion and joined Adaora full-time as a product development manager. She brought fresh perspectives, new ideas, energy that pushed the company forward even as she honored its traditions. Watching her work, seeing the passion in her eyes, I understood that the greatest success of my life was not the stores or the sales or the recognition. It was knowing that what I had built would continue after I was gone. 10 years after the Tokyo launch, I returned to Japan for the opening of our 10th Asian location. The brand had become a fixture of the luxury fashion landscape, recognized globally as a leader in culturally conscious design. I was 62 now, still active in the company, but increasingly focused on mentorship and legacy, rather than day-to-day operations. The Tokyo store had expanded twice since its original opening, now occupying a corner location that drew customers from across the city. I walked through its elegant spaces, touching the bags that bore my grandmother's spiritual fingerprints, remembering the journey that had brought me here. A young employee approached, nervous but determined. "Ms. Monroe, I just wanted to say, you're an inspiration. I came to Japan from Nigeria to study fashion, and when I learned about Adaora, about what you've built, it changed everything for me. It showed me what was possible." I took her hands in mine, feeling the calluses of someone who worked with fabric, the same calluses I had developed decades ago. "What's your name?" "Adana. It means father's daughter in Igbo." I smiled at the connection. "Adana, when I started this company, I was told that nobody wanted my junk, that what I made was worthless. Do you know what I learned from that?" She shook her head. "I learned that the opinion of someone who doesn't understand your vision is worthless, not your work, their opinion." I squeezed her hands. "Whatever you're creating, whatever dream is burning inside you, don't let anyone's dismissal extinguish it. Build anyway, believe anyway. The world will catch up eventually." Adana's eyes were wet with tears. "Thank you, Ms. Monroe. I won't forget." "Good. Now get back to work. These bags don't sell themselves." She laughed and hurried back to her station. I watched her go, feeling the weight of everything I had accomplished and everything that still lay ahead. My husband had said nobody wanted my junk. But here, in Tokyo, surrounded by beauty I had created and lives I had touched, I knew the truth. The whole world wanted what I had made, and I was just getting started. The morning of the anniversary celebration dawned gray and drizzly, typical Tokyo weather for early autumn. But by noon, the clouds had parted, revealing a sky of crystalline blue that seemed to bless the occasion. I stood at the window of my suite at the Palace Hotel, looking out at the Imperial Palace Gardens, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. 20 years. It had been 20 years since Roland uttered the words that still echoed in my memory, still drove me forward, still reminded me of how far I had come. Today, Adaora was celebrating its 10th anniversary in Japan with a special event at our flagship Tokyo store. The celebration would feature a limited edition collection created in collaboration with Japanese textile artists, blending African patterns with Japanese techniques in ways that had never been attempted before. The collection had been promoted for months, building anticipation among fashion enthusiasts across Asia. But I had not anticipated what actually happened. By the time I arrived at the store, the line stretched around the block. Hundreds of people waited patiently, some having camped overnight for the chance to be first through the doors. Japanese media crews filmed the scene, and international fashion journalists documented the phenomenon of a Black American designer inspiring such devotion in one of the world's most discerning markets. The doors opened at 10 o'clock. The first customers entered with reverent excitement, examining each piece in the collection with the careful attention that Japanese consumers brought to everything they valued. I watched from behind the scenes, moved beyond words by the sight of my grandmother's traditions being embraced by people from a culture so different from my own. 3 hours later, every piece was sold. 347 bags, ranging in price from $800 to $3,000, purchased by customers who understood exactly what they were buying. Not just accessories, but artifacts, pieces of cultural history, bridges between worlds. "Sold out," Kenji announced, his voice thick with emotion. "Complete sellout. In 3 hours." I sat down heavily on a stockroom chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. 20 years ago, I had been unable to sell 20 bags at a craft fair in Atlanta. Today, nearly 400 pieces had been claimed in a single morning by customers who had traveled from across Asia to be part of this moment. The celebration continued into the evening with a private party for the staff, partners, and select customers who had supported Adaora's growth in Japan. I gave a speech that I had written and rewritten dozens of times, trying to capture the gratitude and wonder I felt. 20 years ago, I began, I set up a table at a craft fair in Atlanta, Georgia. I had made 20 bags, each one stitched with love and hope, and the traditions my grandmother had passed down to me. I thought I was starting a business. What I was actually starting was a journey. I paused, looking out at the faces before me, Japanese and American, African and European, all united by an appreciation for what Adaora represented. That day, my husband stood beside me and watched people walk past without buying. And when the day seemed to be ending in failure, he said something I have never forgotten. "Nobody wants your junk, Celeste." A murmur rippled through the room. Some knew this story. Others were hearing it for the first time. He was wrong. About the bags, about me, about what I was capable of building. But I didn't know that then. All I knew was that his words hurt and that I had a choice. I could believe him and give up, or I could believe in myself and keep going. I smiled, feeling the warmth of the memory now that the pain had faded. I kept going. Through years of building in secret, through a divorce that freed me to pursue my dreams, through challenges that would have stopped me if I had listened to the doubters. I kept going because somewhere deep inside, I knew what my grandmother had known, that these traditions had value, that this heritage deserved to be celebrated, that the world was waiting for what I had to offer. I raised my glass, looking around the room at the team that had made this possible. Today, we sold out in Tokyo. Not just the collection, but the validation of everything I believed when others didn't. Today, we proved that junk can become treasure if you believe in it enough. The applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet, Japanese and Western customs merging in a standing ovation that felt like the culmination of every sacrifice, every doubt, every moment of determination that had brought me here. After the party, I walked through the empty store one last time. The display cases were bare now, awaiting the next collection, the next chapter in Adora's story. I ran my fingers over the surfaces where my bags had rested, feeling the energy that still lingered. My phone buzzed with a message from Simone, who had watched the event via live stream from Atlanta. "Mom, you did it. You actually did it. Sold out in Tokyo. Grandma Adaze would be crying happy tears right now." I smiled and typed a response. "She's here with me. I feel her every day." "I know you do. I love you, Mom. You're my hero." "I love you too, baby. Now go get some sleep. We have more work to do tomorrow." I spent my final day in Tokyo walking through the city, absorbing its energy, reflecting on the improbable journey that had brought me here. I visited a fabric shop in Nippori, Tokyo's textile district, where bolts of material from around the world lined the shelves. I found African prints among the Japanese silks and European linens, evidence of the global exchange that made Adora possible. I thought about my grandmother, about the fabrics she had brought from Nigeria in 1962, about the skills she had passed down through generations. She could never have imagined this moment. Her granddaughter standing in Tokyo, having built a company that spanned continents, celebrated for the very traditions she had carried across an ocean. But somehow, I believed she knew. Somewhere, across the veil between worlds, Grandmother Adaze was watching. And she was proud. The flight home gave me time to process everything that had happened. I wrote in my journal, capturing thoughts and feelings that would fade with time if not preserved. I drafted ideas for the next collection, for new partnerships, for ways to continue growing while staying true to Adiora's soul. And I thought about Roland, not with anger or bitterness, but with something approaching gratitude. His dismissal had been cruel, his contempt had been painful, his abandonment had been devastating at the time. But it had also set me free. It had forced me to stop seeking validation from someone who could never give it, to find strength within myself that I might never have discovered otherwise. Nobody wants your junk. The words that had wounded me so deeply had become the fuel for everything I had built. They had been the challenge I rose to meet, the standard I exceeded, the doubt I proved wrong with every bag sold, every store opened, every life touched by Adeora's mission. I landed in Atlanta on a Sunday evening, tired but fulfilled. Simone met me at the airport with flowers and hugs, eager to hear every detail of the Tokyo celebration. We talked for hours, mother and daughter, colleagues and friends, two links in a chain that stretched back generations and would continue forward into the future. That night, I sat in my home office, surrounded by photographs and awards and fabric samples, looking at the image of my grandmother that had watched over me since I started this journey. I raised a glass to her memory. "We sold out in Tokyo, Grandma. Every single piece. The whole world wanted what we made." Her photograph smiled back at me, eternal and proud. "Thank you for teaching me," I whispered. "Thank you for believing when no one else did. Thank you for showing me that my hands could create beauty the world would want to see." I set down my glass and picked up a needle and thread, feeling the familiar weight of the tools that had built an empire. There was more work to do tomorrow, more collections to create, more bridges to build between worlds. But tonight, I simply sat in the quiet of my office and sewed, the way I had always sewed, the way I would always sew. The tradition that had started with my grandmother, that had survived contempt and dismissal and every obstacle the world could create, would continue as long as I had breath in my body and thread in my needle. Nobody wanted my junk. The whole world wanted it now. And I had proven, beyond any doubt, that the only opinion that mattered was my own. The years that followed the Tokyo anniversary settled into a rhythm of continued growth and deepening purpose. Adora expanded to 30 countries, with flagship stores on every continent except Antarctica. The company employed over 500 people worldwide, many of them women from communities with limited economic opportunities, all of them part of a mission that transcended mere commerce. I stepped back from daily operations, transitioning into a chairman role that allowed me to focus on strategy and legacy while younger leaders managed the business. Simone became CEO at 32, guiding the company with a vision that honored its traditions while embracing new possibilities. She introduced digital innovations, sustainable practices, and collaborations that I would never have imagined, proving that each generation could add to what the previous one had built. The training academy I had established grew into a global network, with campuses in Atlanta, Lagos, and Tokyo. Young designers from around the world came to learn the principles of culturally conscious fashion, carrying Adora's values into their own ventures. Some became competitors, launching brands that challenged us in the marketplace. I celebrated their success rather than resenting it. The goal had always been to change the industry, not to dominate it. I wrote a second book, this one focused on the artisans whose work formed the foundation of Adora's aesthetic. I traveled to villages across Africa, documenting their techniques, recording their stories, ensuring that their contributions would be remembered, even as the world changed around them. The book became a resource for textile historians and fashion educators, a permanent record of traditions that might otherwise have been lost. On my 70th birthday, Simone organized a celebration that brought together people from every phase of my journey: former employees, current partners, artisans from Nigeria and Ghana and Mali, customers who had become friends over decades of relationship. Even Naomi Cross was there, the boutique owner who had purchased 3 bags at my first craft fair, who had given me my first external validation, who had remained a supporter through every chapter of Adora's growth. 25 years since we met, Naomi said, embracing me. Do you remember what I told you that day? You said the right people would find me. And they did. The whole world found you. She smiled, her own face showing the decades that had passed. But you found yourself first. That was always the secret. The final piece of the story came unexpectedly, on an ordinary afternoon 3 years after my birthday celebration. I was in my home office reviewing designs for an upcoming collection when my assistant informed me that someone was asking to see me. A man. He says he's an old friend. I rarely received unannounced visitors anymore, but something made me agree to see him. When he walked through the door, I recognized him immediately, though the years had changed him significantly. Roland. He was 73 now, gray-haired and thinner than I remembered, with the subdued demeanor of a man who had lost more battles than he had won. He stood in my office doorway, taking in the evidence of my success, the awards on the walls, the photographs with celebrities and world leaders, the fabric samples that spoke of an empire he had once dismissed. Hello, Celeste. Hello, Roland. It's been a long time. 20 years since the divorce. He stepped inside, moving slowly. I've watched you from a distance. The stores, the magazine covers, the White House. You've done incredible things. I have. Things I said you would never do. Things I actively tried to discourage. He met my eyes, and I saw something I had never seen in him before. Genuine humility. I was wrong about you, Celeste. About your talent, about your potential, about everything. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I considered his apology, weighing its sincerity against decades of dismissal. Why are you here, Roland? Because I'm dying. Cancer. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. He attempted a smile that didn't quite succeed. I didn't want to die without telling you that I'm sorry, without admitting that the biggest mistake of my life was not believing in you. I sat with this information, feeling the strange mixture of emotions it provoked. Sadness for a man facing his mortality, closure for wounds that had never fully healed, vindication that needed no expression because my success spoke for itself. Sit down, I said finally. Tell me about your life. What happened after Vanessa? He sat, and we talked for 2 hours. He told me about the marriages that failed, the careers that disappointed, the loneliness that had become his constant companion. He asked about Simone, about Ada Ora, about the journey he had been too blind to appreciate when we were married. At the end, he stood to leave, and I walked him to the door. For what it's worth, he said, I'm proud of you. I know I have no right to say that. I know my opinion doesn't matter anymore, but I'm proud of what you've built, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to support you. Thank you, Roland. I hope you find peace in the time you have left. I already have. He smiled, genuine this time. Seeing what you've accomplished, it doesn't make up for anything, but it gives me hope. Hope that the world can still surprise us, that people can become more than we expected. He left, and I never saw him again. He died 4 months later, and Simone attended his funeral on my behalf. I sent flowers and a card expressing condolences to his family, but I did not grieve. Roland had been a chapter of my life, important for what he had taught me about myself, but closed long ago. I am 75 now, still working, still creating, still finding joy in the craft that has defined my life. Ada Ora continues to grow under Simone's leadership, reaching customers my grandmother could never have imagined, carrying traditions across generations and oceans. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my workshop, I think about the woman I was at 30, standing at a craft fair table, listening to her husband tell her that nobody wanted her junk. I wish I could go back and whisper in her ear, "Keep going, it gets better. The world is waiting for what you have to offer." But perhaps she didn't need to hear it. Perhaps she already knew, somewhere deep inside, that her grandmother's gift was real, that her hands had value, that the only opinion that ultimately mattered was her own. I pick up a needle and thread, feeling the familiar weight, and I begin to sew. The tradition continues, passed down through generations, carrying forward into a future I can only imagine. Nobody wanted my junk, but I did, and that was always enough.